some of you know, I spent 12 years as executive director of Chabot Space and Science Center, and retired from that position last summer as I couldn't figure out who to vote for governor. You know, it was between, you know, living in California, it was between either Gary Coleman and the stripper. So, well, yeah, actually she was number 7 or number 8 on the reception of votes list. That just, well, maybe, I don't know, maybe she could have erased that $30 billion deficit for California, who knows. Nonetheless, another story, as is Chabot. But one of the things that I've always had an interest in, and you know, you talk about how kids get interested in things like astronomy, in my case, or you know, collection of rocks or meteorites and that sort of thing, are museums. And I can remember as a kid going to a museum and purchasing a little 50-cent piece of Canon Diablo. And that was my very first, which I still have, my very first meteorite. And since then, I went on to do some degree work, and I love the course description. Dust. Can you imagine going home and telling your wife that I'm taking a course in dust? So solar system dust and that sort of thing. But nonetheless, one of my loves, vocations as well as avocations, has been meteoritics. So this is going to be a talk that's a little different than the first 2 talks today. This is more of a, should we say, no pun intended, down-to-earth type of talk. And yeah, I knew that would at least wake somebody up. Thank you, thank you. I knew it would wake at least someone up. And it's interesting how all this got started for me. I've done a lot of crater research. You'll see a little bit of that work. But I've just really become a real advocate of being able to show kids and adults alike meteorites. Being a museum director, I can tell you, people love to look through telescopes, and they love to touch meteorites. There's just something magical about pulling a meteorite out of your pocket and having a kid touch it. Just like it's magical to have a kid look through a telescope at the moon or Mars or Jupiter, or some of these wonderful deep sky objects. There's just something that's special about that. And so it's something that kind of grew in an interest in me to the point that I had a publisher a couple years ago contact me and say, hey, we know you have a good background in meteoritics. Would you mind writing a kind of a down-to-earth book on meteorites? There are a lot of really good high-level books out there, but there's not like a more current down-to-earth type of book on meteoritics. And so I wrote a book called Falling Stars, and have been absolutely surprised at how well the book has been received. And the publisher, of course, is very happy about how well Falling Stars has been received. I had opportunities to travel across the country and do lectures and book signings, so it's been kind of fun. But let's get into it. We're going to talk a little bit about meteorites, meteors and meteorites first, with the lights off. Then we're going to have kind of a more of an open show and tell type session, which really, one of the reasons that Tippy put me last on this schedule was to give people an opportunity more at the end, just come up and look at stuff. A lot of meteorites up here for you to look at, a lot of meteorites for you to pick up. Just don't walk away with the Martian slices, I would ask, okay? And if you, seriously, we'll talk more about things that if you may want, I know, that's not the door prize, Tippy, okay? The Martian is not a door prize. But nonetheless, you'll get a chance to take a look at some things firsthand. And since it's the end of the day, you have plenty of time to mill around, ask questions, that sort of thing. So let's turn off the lights and let's talk about falling stars. Let's talk a little bit first, if we go to the next slide. Let's talk a little bit first just about meteor watching. Just a real quick recap. Now, I know that probably none of you were around to see this particular shower. This was the Great Leonid Storm in 1833, a beautiful depiction that you probably have seen the artwork from this. And some of you may have seen the 66 Leonids. Let me ask a question. How many of you were fortunate enough to see the 1966 Leonids? A few of us. I was like 12 years old. I heard there was going to be this meteor shower. It may be kind of good. And so I went outside, and I was getting only measly rates of like 5,000, 6,000 an hour. And I thought, well, this is my first meteor shower. They must all be like that. Well, you know the story. There's like my first comet was like Kiyosaki, and I thought, oh, they must all be like that. Well, of course, you find out that they're not. So anyway, let's go to the next slide, please. Meteor watching is one of the most simple course of observational astronomy. You just need appropriately dressed. You need a lawn chair or chaise lounge to relax in, food and appropriate drink. You love going to meteor watches where someone's just drunk out of their mind. They're facing the ground and seeing, 10,000 an hour type of thing. Not that anyone in this room has ever done that, right? Binoculars. I like keeping a pair of binoculars by my side just in case a very bright meteor, fireball, bolide produces a train or a trail, so I can actually get an opportunity to observe that. Tape recorder, which can be dangerous. because you may have to go through, if you're going to play for your church group next Sunday, and edit a few words out. And of course, dark and clear skies always do help. So we can go to the next slide, please. Just a couple types of meteor watching. We're going to spend just a little bit of time on this. Visual, you're doing things like hourly counts, magnitude estimates, duration, train, that smoke trail, etc. Telescopic, a lot of people do binocular observing of meteors, photographic, and spectroscopic. So there's some of this work that still goes on today. Next slide, please. Basically, I don't know why they came back up again. We'll go to the next slide then. We're going to make sure this is a test to see if you saw that. Okay, next slide. There we go. Now, I don't know about you, but this is like the typical observer. You're sitting there just checking out, or the thing that just hacks me off the most, you're in a group of about 10 people. You're out just kind of having a nice evening watching, meteors. And everybody says, oh my God, and by the time you turn this, -5 magnitude bolide's gone, and you can kind of rip your neck around, you have whiplash, and yet you miss it. So that's probably the average, amateur out meteor watching. All right, next slide, please. The Leonids, of course, put on an incredible show for us in both 2001 and 2002. 2001, we had an opportunity to go about 50 miles east of San Francisco up into the foothills, and just, it reminded me, not quite, but almost like the 66 Leonids, where you could actually watch the shower and watch these meteors coming out of the horizon, and to turn around like a waterfall and watch these meteors go over your head. It was just an absolute incredible experience. In 2002, Debbie and I got a chance to spend the evening or the morning, even though you had a full moon, observing the Leonids with David and Wendy Levy. And that was exciting because, there wasn't the type of activity because of moonlight you saw in 2001, but it still was neat to see this incredible show itself. Next slide, please. You've seen all these wonderful photographs of Leonids, just, an image where, just multiple streaks, and occasional, as I like to call them, UFO will wander through your field, but there's something in this particular photograph, something like about 100 meteors, 100 Leonids in that particular photo. You can't see them all. And the next one, please. Is that a time? It is time exposure, yes. And of course, sometimes the Leonids will leave an absolute wonderful smoke trail or train, as we refer to it as. So the Leonids put on a great show for us. Next slide, please. And so, just to very quickly, as you probably know, the Leonids is kind of a cool detective story. Why do we have these about 32, 33, 34-year little spikes, to say the least, in activity? It has to do, of course, with Tempel-Tuttle, the comet, where the Leonids come from. The fact that as the comet goes around the sun, the trail material has been left at different orbits. Jupiter pulls on this stuff. Successive reappearances, returns of Tempel-Tuttle create new trails. And of course, as we wham into these trails, especially the newer trails, the better shower we have. So nonetheless, it was an interesting way that I've seen that the science of meteor predictions really grow a lot during this whole Leonid scenario, as we became better and better at being able to predict not only the rates, but the time that these things would peak. And these guys were getting within minutes of actually being correct. It was a whole new level of meteor work. Next slide, please. So what we're at is 2002, of course, has come and gone. 2006, look at about 100 an hour, which is not a bad evening. It's not 10,000 or 100,000 an hour, but 100 an hour is not bad. 2007, 100 an hour. 2033, 2066, 2033, 2066, those next 33-year jumps. There will be no storms due to Jupiter again, so watch Jupiter that year instead. And the next big show we'll all be around for is 2099. Now, I mentioned these in particular because I'm going to tell you, I don't know what the reaction was. In fact, I know what the reaction was across the country. At Chabot, it's in the middle of, well, it's up in the Oakland Hills, but, light polluted San Francisco. We had to turn thousands of people away from the science center, from the observatory that morning in 2001 because they wanted to get up there and see the meteors. It's an opportunity for us as professional and amateur astronomers across the country to really, again, get the public involved. You know the reaction to Mars last summer. You know how the public reacts to these things. I get a little tired of hearing that there's a lack of interest in space and astronomy in this country, yet you see these big events like this, and people just really, really enjoy it. All right, next slide, please. Let's go on and talk a little bit about meteorites themselves. We go to the next slide, please. A cute little foxtrot comic. He's out with his mitt and his mask catching falling stars. And of course, next morning he says, these meteor showers are always such a letdown. And good morning to you, too. So I don't know how you try to catch your meteorites, but hopefully you have had a little bit better success than foxtrot. We can go on to the next slide, please. People always are bringing me, whether I was at Chabot or at the planetarium in Jacksonville or as a teacher, were always bringing me things that they swore were, a meteorite. There are 4 major clues. One is most, not all, but most attract a magnet. The second is you have this very dark material called a fusion crust, unless it's been sitting out like in the middle of the Sahara Desert, been blasted by sand for, 1,000 years. Aerodynamic shaping. Many of these meteorites have this wonderful aerodynamic shaping that show they've been through the atmosphere. And finally, this really cool thing called thumbprinting that you can really see in meteorites that show this kind of tumbling as they come through the atmosphere. My funniest story, when I was in Jacksonville, I had a man call me and he said, I swear I saw this thing hit this tree and it, like split the tree and all this other stuff. And so I said, okay, well, bring it on into me and let me take a look at it. So he brings her this piece of ugly slag. It was ugly. Not only was it ugly, it was infested with red ants. Now, last time I checked, they haven't beamed down on meteorites yet. But and I said, I hate to tell you, sir, but this is not a meteorite. This is a piece of slag, and I don't know, maybe you were drinking moonshine, and I don't know what the problem was, but this is not meteoritic. The fellow not only threatened to, let's see, I won't use any improper language in this particular statement, but the fellow basically threatened to, shall we say, take me outside and dust me off. He actually was going to have a lawyer sue me because I did not declare this a meteorite. Because what's happened, they've got these like things that say, there's lawyers calling now. They always catch up with you, don't they? But it's funny because, what's happened is that some meteorites go for a lot of money. We're talking about thousands. Like some of the lunar meteorites go for 10,000 to, I've even seen them as high as, hold on your seats, $100,000 a gram. A gram. And so they see these ding dollar signs, and they think, well, here's this Dr. Reynolds trying to take our big, lottery-winning space rock away from us, and, they could have the ants and rock back too. I would have even bought them a can of Raid just to get it out of my office. All right, so we go to the next slide, please. There are 3 basic types of meteorites, well, actually 4. There are irons, stony irons, stones, and what I call meteorongs, because they ain't a meteorite, and they're just some really terrible examples out there, and people can, eBay, it's a good place if you know what you're doing, you know who you're buying from to buy meteorites. I'll tell you, almost on a weekly basis, a meteorong appears on eBay, so you need to, kind of know the stuff if you're going to buy this. All right, let's go on to the next slide, please. Talk a little bit about irons. Iron is a predominant metal. Nickel you can have between 5 and 50%, a trace of cobalt. Sounds like, someone in the kitchen cooking here. You actually have 3 major groupings based on the iron to nickel ratio. Hexahedrites, octahedrites, and this has to do actually with crystalline structure that forms, and ataxites. So you can have actually 3 different groups of these iron meteorites. We go to the next slide, please. This is not how it fell. Okay, let me explain this. This is a Gibeon meteorite. And I show this for a couple reasons. First of all, this was a chunk of iron meteorite that was machined into a sphere. There was so much of this brought out of Africa in the 1990s that they made knives, they made spheres, they made wedding bands, et cetera, out of this Gibeon. And This is kind of a cool example because you can see very clearly these very fine lines called Vidman-Staten, the Vidman-Staten pattern. And this is something that's recognizable only in octahedrites. No earth metal does this. Only octahedrite iron meteorites. Now, obviously, you can see this thing is just slightly magnetic here. And it was funny, to give you an idea how this field has gone pricing-wise, which is insane. When I bought this in like 1993, I paid like $100 for it. You know, and you think, you're insane, Reynolds, paying my wife says, you're insane paying $100 for a cue ball. This bad boy, it's about the size of a cue ball. This bad boy today goes for about $750. None of my stock has done as well as this meteorite. I see the lawyer's calling me again because you call this a meteorite, what happened to my aunt fisted piece of slag. So anyway, it's a nice sample just to show you Vidman-Staten patterns, the magnetic and such as that. Next slide, please. A lot of good iron examples out there. Again, remember the idea of thumbprinting or megalith? Look at this. You can see this beautiful thumbprinting throughout this piece of box hole from Australia. Just a really cool example of what I'm talking about. You can see also a little bit of oxidation. Talk about that in a moment. Next slide, please. Odessa, of course, are one of our two major craters here in the United States. Again, see the thumbprinting? Really nice thumbprinting. This meteorite, a little bit of like a fusion crust type of look, maybe a little oxidation there too. And again, if you had the chunk in front, you can see a little bit of aerodynamic shaping. Next slide, please. Sakot-Alin. This is a cool meteorite because this fall occurred very recently, 1947, over Russia. And this stuff, I got some small pieces and a couple big chunks of this with me. It looks like shrapnel. But basically, when this meteorite came in, it just detonated, and it just sprayed the shrapnel over, producing over 100 small craters stuck in trees and all over the place. And you can really see the destructive power that this type of impact can have. So very, very, very unusual because of this sort of, should I say, shrapnel-like appearance. Next slide, please. Goose Lake. This is a cool meteorite, but this has to do with Chabot Space and Science Center, where which I directed for a number of years. This was found by a couple hunters in 1936, 1947 on the California-Oregon border. And so the director Chabot, the second director Chabot at the time, Earl Lindsley, was contacted by the Smithsonian to recover this meteorite. So they trucked in with horses and a huge wagon and hauled this sucker out. Next slide, please. Well, I tried to put this in my carry-on luggage, but it wouldn't fit. By the way, speaking of carry-on luggage, as I mentioned, I get a chance to go around and do a number of lectures on meteoritics. Have you ever tried to take a meteorite through airport security? You want a new level of challenge? Try it. The TSA just loves big iron meteorites and slices coming through their X-ray machine. There have been many a time that, well, no, it's been every time that I have been stopped hauling meteorites through airport security. I'm not going, am I going to put a, $2,000 Mars rock in my suitcase for someone to, of course they wouldn't know what it was, but you know what I'm saying, you got this little package of meteorites and, some irons and some slices and some stones, and, next thing you're doing is you're, being frisked, and, it's like, but here's my book and there are pictures of it inside of it. So anyway, it's a challenge taking this stuff through, and you too can get those nice little TSA tags. How many of you had the TSA go into your suitcase? A few of us have. Yeah, well, I tried putting meteorites in my suitcase. That made a difference. I get these little, I love it. I have a wall full of these TSA tags saying, "Dear passenger, we have gone through for security reasons and checked your suitcase to make sure you weren't carrying any, slag rocks or, well, it's just ant-infested slag rocks." All right, next slide, please. Beware of rusters. Now, this is something that I need to speak to because of a couple things. First of all, if you go out and shop for a meteorite, you'll find that there's one or two, and I think this is the right one I picked up, and again, you can take a look at it a little bit later on, that literally will rust, will oxidize in front of your eyes. Nantan is notorious for rusting. It just literally, you can buy it, put it on your shelf, and it'll fall apart in front of you. It's very inexpensive, but there's a reason, because it's a terrible ruster. There's another one called Campo de Sio, which is, actually there's two types of Campos. There's a Campo A, or old Campo, which apparently spent a lot of time underwater, and there's a Campo B, which is a newer find they've just located, which was recovered on dry land. Be careful, because you can get a meteorite like a Nantan or Campo, old Campo, at a very cheap price, 1 or 2 or 5 cents a gram. But what you end up with is, a pile of rust, and I do not exaggerate. However, the good news is there may be a couple alternatives. A friend of mine by the name of Bill Mason has worked for years as an industrial chemist. He has background in geology. He's just developed a process for rescuing Nantans. And I got a slab, he gave me a slab of a Nantan that's been cut and preserved with his process. And it's been like this for a year, and it hasn't started falling apart yet. Now, it's interesting how he got into this. He apparently was doing some work. He did a lot of work in preserving and dealing with dinosaur bones. And so someone couldn't pay him off. So he said, well, I'll send you a whole bunch of meteorites. Guess what they sent him? Nantans. So he has this whole bucket of these rusting pieces of garbage. And what am I going to do? So what did he do? He invented a process to stop the rusting. Now, having moved back from California where it's dry to Florida where it's not, I've had to look for ways to make sure my other meteorites, my Gibeons and San Diablos and all the other irons on my collection, are not falling apart. So there's actually emitters you can now buy. Very inexpensive, a couple bucks. You put them in your cabinet or put them with your meteorite, and it just absolutely stops the rust, the oxidation in its tracks. So there are some treatments that are out there that we're still looking at, but I think that Bill's process, from what I see, if you can take a Nantan and stop the sucker from falling apart, which he has done, you may be well on your way to being able to preserve some of these things. Next, please. Stony meteorites. Interesting, over 94% of observed falls are stony meteorites. Everybody thinks they're irons because they're heavy, they're easy to identify. Nope, they're stones. Of course, we know they're from crust and mantle of asteroids. Few are theorized to be from comets. They contain approximately 75 to 90%, a fairly high number compared to the irons. Silicate materials. A number also contain nickel iron or iron nickel alloy, and you have two groups based on chondrules, these little circular things you'll see in some of the slices I have up here. Chondrites, which mean they have them, or achondrites, which means they don't. Next slide, please. This is what's known as an ordinary chondrite, Wanjing, and notice in this particular meteorite, see the fusion crust, the very black crust right there. You can even see the thumbprinting, kind of an aerodynamic shaping, the types of things I'm talking about when it comes to identifying a meteorite. Stuff really does exist. Next slide, please. Some other examples, again, notice the fusion crust here on this piece of Johnson City, very, very dark, blackish. And notice this slice, see the little bits of metal, the little metal inclusion, little shiny things. Again, the better thing, I've got examples up here. You spend some time kind of looking at some of these examples. They're very, very nice. You can see what I'm talking about firsthand. Next slide, please. Yeah, I think it's Tennessee. Yeah. Milbilili, which is, I love the Australian meteorites. The names of the Australian meteorites are the best. Camaldonga. Billy Goat Donga. I mean, there's these Cocklebiddy. I mean, they have these great names for meteorites because what they do is they name them near the closest city or region they fell. So, I'm now starting my Donga collection, my Camel Donga, my Billy Goat Donga. There's a whole bunch of Donga meteorites from Australia. So, some people collect really strange things, and, I guess that goes beside the ant-infested slag. You put your Donga collection. All right, so Milbilili is an eucrite, a very, very rare type of meteorite, achondrite, a wonderful, wonderful fall. Next slide, please. Going to the next classification of meteorites, stony irons. You have silicates and iron-nickel mixtures in roughly equal proportion. These are absolutely beautiful meteorites. And in fact, I am going to pass one around now, and I'll get it back and I'll tell you what it's worth. This is a piece of Imelak. This is kind of the classic stony iron palisite, and there's a little box that it's in, and there's a little button inside, so push the button, you'll see these beautiful olivine crystals within this meteorite. So you basically know that it's a pretty spectacular rock. About 1% of these falls have been Stony-Irons. The three groups, I already mentioned the pallasites, which you're going to see one, Imalak, a very, very well-known Chilean fall. Mesositerites, which are kind of considered the garbage can meteorites, but are, to me, the most beautiful of all the meteorites. And Lodronites. Next slide, please. And here's another Imalak slice. This stuff is spectacular. It is just absolutely beautiful. You see these beautiful olivine crystals within this iron-nickel matrix. Just slice. Outside they look not very pretty. Inside you slice it, they're just spectacular. You see a lot of jewelry made like this. My friend Bob Haig, who most of you know as the Meteorite Man, has actually gotten some very good quality olivine crystals out of these and had them faceted. And we worked with a man and woman last year when I was still at Chabot, who she had her wedding band made of olivine crystals. Now, very, very unusual, but quite spectacular. So a very beautiful type of meteorite. Tells a good story, though, about the solar system, which is important. Next slide, please. This is a Saharan fall, SAH 85001. It's a mesosiderite. Again, you can see the black inclusions, the metallic sparkle. It's an absolutely spectacular meteorite. But again, tells us a little bit about the melting processes while in space. Meteorites really give us some real clues, not just asteroid and asteroid formation. Obviously, you're talking about some very rare types we'll talk about in a moment, but you also get a feel for just the formation of the solar system, the history, the age of the solar system of meteorites. They're a major, major piece of our research we do here on Earth. Next slide, please. Speaking of rare and interesting meteorites, there are some I want to show you, just some interesting things to look at. Next slide, please. You can kind of collect meteorites in what's known as micro collection. In fact, I've got a couple of my micro boxes up here. Some people complain, rightfully so, that these things have gotten really expensive. That's true. So the meteorites have gotten up to, like I said, I talked about some of the lunar meteorites, $10,000 a gram, which is insane. But what a lot of collectors have started doing is putting together what they call a micro or small collection of meteorites. And what I do is I usually encourage kids. You may not be able to afford the huge piece or something that's is massive, but start with something small. And that's kind of what many of us did. We went to a museum or to a rock show, and someone gave us, or we bought a little piece of a meteorite. So we instead start with micro collections. This is a selection of Chilean meteorites. In fact, this one right here is an Imalak. Now that sure doesn't look like that beautiful slice that's being passed around now. But yeah, it gives you a feel for what these smaller Imalaks look like. Next slide, please. Now you want to talk about something very special. Old lovers of Mars, Dr. Parker and others of us in the room who are really interested in understanding more about Mars. These are the famous SNCs. The three major classifications of Martian meteorites: Chirgati, Nakhla, and Chassigny. Now, this, I wish I could say this was in my collection. If this was, I would not be here. I would be owning one of those islands off the Florida Keys. This is actually from Smithsonian's collection. Chabot had worked with the Smithsonian putting together a nice exhibit, and so when I was working with them, they said, well, would you like to see the SNCs? And these are some of the largest pieces of SNC. You're probably looking at probably about $1 million sitting right there. Maybe a little bit more, it just depends. But it gives you a feel for the value of some of the Martian meteorites. And of course, the fun thing about this is you got to remember, Martians weren't recognized, Martian meteorites weren't recognized as so until the 1980s. We're not talking about something we've known about forever and ever and ever. We're talking about chunks that were picked up, Antarctica. People start looking at comparing them to some of the Viking data and saying, hey, it's kind of like thumbprints. This stuff's matching up. So, and we went back, of course, and you start looking at other meteorites, and voila. We found a number of these wonderful, what we call SNC classifications of Martians. Next slide, please. Of course, probably the most famous and the most controversial this time of the Martians is ALH 84001. It's an achondrite, it's a SNCC, and this is the famous Mars rock that life might or might not have existed in at one time. And this, of course, is at the Smithsonian. It was interesting. When the Smithsonian was revamping their entire Hall of Gem Minerals, meteorite stones, etc., they had 3 samples available for the public to look at. They had some odd crystal. They had the Hope Diamond, and they had ALH 84001. Of course, all the public go, oh, look at the Hope Diamond. I'm thinking to myself, if this is, and of course at that time, the controversy hadn't really bloomed that maybe these weren't little fossilized bacterial inclusions. The public understood what that really was. That made the Hope Diamond look, worthless compared to this particular meteorite. So it's interesting the public's perception. You got to admit, that's ugly. That's just not a very pretty meteorite to the untrained eye. But to some of us, like the Don Parkers of the world, the Mike Reynolds of the world, others, that's a, looks like Donga, doesn't it? We won't go there. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. That's in Camel Donga. Okay. ALH 84001, again, this is a thin section. Just give you a feel for some of the stuff they were looking at. Next slide, please. There's the Antarctic lunar meteorite. That's a chunk. And you got to understand, very little lunar meteorite. Stuff that's been knocked off the moon, not by Apollo or by some Soviet spacecraft and back to the Earth. That's a huge chunk of a lunar meteorite, and there's so little of it here that it's pretty spectacular. Next slide, please. Chicken Little says, the sky is falling. Now, one of the fun things, of course, is to track meteorite falls. And of course, last year, we had this fabulous Park Forest fall outside Chicago, one of the suburbs of Chicago. Actually, I've got a Park Forest meteorite here to show you. And, people weren't only collecting the meteorites, they were collecting like sections of roof that they had impacted, sawing out people's roofs and stuff like that. So it's kind of interesting. Let's go to the next slide, please. I love this. And remember, graduation is not an ending, but a beginning. Yeah, it must be that ant-infested piece of slag coming in there. So anyway, let me go to the next slide, please. Speaking about impactors, we obviously see craters all over the Earth. Obviously, we start, looking at the moon, and you go back to the Earth, you see a variety of craters. We've become better and better about picking out old impact sites. It's become a kind of a fun thing. And in fact, we're turning up new craters all the time, which I'll talk a little bit about some of the research I've been doing. So next slide, please. This is a mailbox that was hit by a meteorite in Claxton, Georgia. Now, you may think, oh, that's kind of cool. Everybody's seated, right? This mailbox sold a couple years ago for $20,000. Talk about special delivery. And all of these people got big eyes when it comes to, their ant-infested slag. $20,000 for that mailbox. But I'll do one better. Next slide, please. The Peekskill car, of course, everyone remembers the Peekskill fall. The fabulous video of this bolide coming in over the high school football game and hitting Michelle Knapp's 1972 Malibu Classic. It's probably worth about $50. She sold it for $50,000. But you can buy this car today if you'd like to. Over $200,000. So you can have a Malibu Classic for just a few dollars there. Nonetheless, can you imagine coming out and seeing this in your trunk? It's like, gee, money, why me? Well, she kind of hit the lottery. Malibu Classic, I love it. She not only kept the meteorite, but she sold the meteorite. And Peekskill is a hard one to get. Usually you're paying about $20 to $25 a gram for Peekskill if you can even find it. It's a tough meteorite. It wasn't a huge chunk, but it was big enough to do in the Malibu Classic. Next slide, please. And it says here that no one has been known to have been struck by a falling meteorite. Next slide. Although a dog was killed in Egypt by a meteorite years ago. Next slide. What do they mean, although a dog? This is the Nanakla Fall, of course, where the story is that one dog got kind of hammered by one of the Nanakla meteorites, and it's been something that's been kind of, it's just kind of a fun, very esoteric thing, but yet it's something you hear quite a bit of conversation about. Nonetheless, we know there have been strikes. The obvious one is Silicon, Alabama, in 1954, I want to say, where the woman was relaxing on her couch across, by the way, from the Comet Drive-In Theater. And then came in this meteorite and ricocheted off the wall and hit her in the hip, that sort of thing. There was a young man that supposedly was pelted by a couple stones in Africa just a few years ago, and the story goes on and on. So anyway, next slide, please. One of the things I've had a good time doing is, for museum work, is doing a lot of crater research. Our own Odessa, Texas crater, which really kind of looks just like a little bit of should I say, depression. Next slide, please. Obviously Canyon Diablo, which is tougher these days to research than it used to be in Gene Shoemaker's days, because it is kind of a commercialized place, and they really don't necessarily like a lot of attention to what goes on there. And next slide, please. A crater I researched twice in the last couple of years in South Africa, the Swang crater. This is only recognized as being meteoritic about 10 years ago. So we've had some opportunities to go and do some survey work, take some of the various samples of impact, and maybe even a couple samples we're having identified right now, are they truly meteoritic in nature. Now it's funny when you go out and do this crater work, obviously GPS has made it easier for us, but I still use some of the simple stuff like a big magnet. And so I can remember one of my research sites, I had my camera bag, I had this huge magnet in it, and we're saying, well, do you think there's any samples available or any samples around? We don't find anything. So I set the camera bag on the ground, and these things just go ring out of the ground on the side of my camera bag. I said, well, I think we just found the mother lode. So, so some of the simple techniques like using magnets do work. So it's not, it may not be, ant-infested slag, but nonetheless, meteorites will do for me too. So next slide, please. We look for a lot of evidence of impact. Melts, impactites, shatter cones. These are things we look at to understand when this impact occurred, how did the Earth, quote, react, unquote. And that's become a very interesting study for a number of us. Next slide, please. This is something called a shatter cone. It's from Beaverhead, Montana. And this is an evidence of impact. And it's one of these things that, again, when this great shock occurred, surrounding material basically fractured, forming these things called shatter cones. So it gives you an idea of some of the evidence. Those shatter cones are much smaller than this, but it gives you an idea of some of the evidence you can find. Next slide, please. So people often say you want more information. Some recommended books. If you want some of the classics, if you go to the next slide, please. I love Neininger's books. Find a Falling Star and Arizona's Meteorite Crater. Wonderful reads, very historic. Neininger was a great storyteller. He could really bring to life some of his adventures going out and collecting meteorites. It's really good stuff. Next slide, please. Dick Norton's books on meteorites. If you really want a lot of detail, chemistry, all sorts of things, Dick's books are very good. Meteorites from A to Z. I've actually got some copies here. It's a good book. In fact, the updated version is out. That if you're using something just to go through and say, okay, what type of fall, what type of find, what type of meteorite is this, how many were found, or check off on your own little collection itself, Meteorites from A to Z is kind of a fun one. Next slide. So, as I always like to say, by the way, I started saying this before Jack Horkheimer started saying. I was teaching school in the early 1970s and started saying, keep looking up, and I think it got pirated. Anyway, keep looking up. Turn on lights for a second. Let's talk a little bit about some of these other things. Where's the MLAC? Is it circulate? Uh-huh. It's circulate. Tiffany has a new door prize. It's funny. People often say, well, how much are these things worth? Are they, something that you really want to save or keep? It's just something you invest in. How crazy you can get. I just got back from Tucson, which is the big rock, gem, and mineral show. I did some book signings out there for Falling Stars. And it's always interesting to see what's new, what's the latest, what's the greatest. And of course, the big items being talked about is park forest. This is just one of the literally thousands of park forest stones that belted Chicago. the Park Forest suburbs. So it gives you a feel for the types of stones that you'll find. And of course, the big talk, out there is the recent influx of all the Moroccan and Algerian meteorites, Northwest Africans, NWAs. There's been it's been almost a flood of meteorites coming out of the Sahara Desert. And you think about this. You're walking along, there's sand, 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 and then there's a rock. Well, guess what? That rock is most likely meteoritic. And so what's happened, the nomads, honest to God, have found out about this, and they don't even have to worry about, ant-infested slag. They're actually going out and finding literally thousands of falls in that whole Saharan desert region. And so we've been very fortunate that we've gotten a lot of really cool, kind of ordinary types of meteorites out also, but also some new, nice Martian meteorites. For example, this is a really thin slice of a basalt, Martian basaltic meteorite called DAG 476. Now, in the old day, you probably would have bought this for maybe $100 a gram. Then ALH 84001 came along, and the Martian values for Martian meteorites went from $100 a gram to $2,000 a gram. And when you go to shows, you can usually find it for about $500 to $1,000 a gram. But this is a nice Martian that you'll see. It's an achondrite, so you're not going to find any chondrules within it. Just a very pretty section, little piece of Mars. And so there's some of the newer Martians up here also. I was talking about Sakota-Lin, and I'm going to go ahead and pass this around. This is that fragment, one of the like shrapnel-like pieces that I mentioned. I mean, you look at this thing, it's like a piece of shrapnel. And it's been kind of a cool find. There's a whole bunch of slices and stuff for you to come up and look at. I also mentioned the idea of preserving iron meteorites against some of these emitters that you can put with your collection. They've actually made baggies now that you can put with your collection. And I'm not up here selling these. In fact, I got information if you want to contact the guy. But I just thought that, it's kind of cool. We're getting to a place now we start talking about taking. And look at this. My Nantan, I just opened up. There's already pieces of rust on the table. This is, see? Anyone want meteorites? There you go. This is Nantan. And it's just, you can see it's just falling apart in my hand. It's just such a terrible ruster. However, this is also Nantan. And you can see this is actually a very, up here, not fall off. A very, ants! What do you know? There are ants in this piece of Nantan. A very, very stable piece of Nantan. And after he did his chemical preserving, and that we're starting with first to be able to inhibit further rusting and take the rust out. Then it's been coated with an inhibitor to make sure that additional oxidation doesn't occur. So there may be hope for Nantan and some of the other rusters. Nice piece of Canyon Diablo. Again, you'll get a chance to come and look at some big slabs and different types of samples and that sort of thing. Yes, go to the questions. Tippy?
I've got some meteorites that are sliced and what can I do to
if you have small amounts, there are people. I've actually done some, so we can talk afterwards. But there are people who do that sort of thing. See, Lori keeps on calling me. I tell you, they're after my. You can talk to me, and we can either hook me up with me or some others can do it. Oh, okay. Well, on Wheel of Fortune, he has Vanna White. Well, I'm even better than that. I've got Debbie Reynolds. The true famous one in my family, my wife. But nonetheless, it's been kind of fun. Say hello for me too, Don, okay, will you? Okay. It's my lawyer. He's calling Don now. Nonetheless, I did bring some copies. My publisher loves to send me out on talks. I did bring some copies of Falling Stars. And when I went out and started doing book signings, it was funny because everybody kept on saying, well, aren't you selling meteorites? I said, no, because I've written a book. You can go somewhere else and buy meteorites. So what I did I did at the Astronomical League convention last summer. I brought some small pieces along. So when I was out in Tucson, I brought back a whole bunch of different types of meteorites. If you're interested in buying some, you could buy one of everything, the smallest amount, and pay $35. You could buy one of everything, the biggest pieces I have, and pay $325. So there's a whole variety of Ben Sauer, which has a nice little fusion crust, to Sakota-Lin, some small, mostly small stuff. You want bigger stuff? go see Bob or others or talk to me. If you say, I want to buy some meteorites and tell me some of your favorite dealers, I'll be glad to put you and give you their names. I mean, I don't get a cut out of this. I just have people I deal with when I buy some of the bigger samples. I'm doing research, or for the museum. And ones at Chabot, I buy meteorites for Chabot all the time. And so it's you get to know people, and people you're going to get a good price, or dependable, or a good slice that's not going to fall apart. But even with stones, I mean, you can get a big slab like this guy here. This is from one stone that was about 82 kilograms, and so it had been sliced. I mean, you got to make sure even slabs like this, that they're not cracked or going to fall apart. Someone may sell it to you for a good price, but it turns out to be like an antenna, too good to be true price. So if you're interested, talk to me, pick up my card. I have some business cards. I have some business cards up here, and drop me an email. It's pretty easy. It's astrogator90@aol.com. I'm with the University of Florida, so okay, all you Seminole and Hurricane fans in the room, you'll have to forgive me that Astrogator. So anyway, astrogator90@aol.com. I got some business cards. You can pick those up. And we're going to be up here. Debbie's going to set up some meteorites and books for sale. I'll be here to talk about this. I'm even willing to scrawl an X on a book if someone wants an autograph. And we'll open it for questions. Otherwise, I'm going to let you come up and wander. The reason Tippy put me at the end of the day so people have time to come and look at the stuff, and we'll go from there. Questions? Guess that means no.